The sound was wrong. It wasn't the familiar, rhythmic sigh of the wind through the pines, or the brittle scuttling of a squirrel in the undergrowth. It was a shallow, percussive chattering, a frantic, unnatural rhythm that didn't belong in the deep stillness of the first snow. Lily stopped, her head tilted, the worn leather of her small boots silent on the new powder. Her grandmother, Alara, had always told her she heard the world's secrets because she didn't let her eyes lie to her. And right now, her ears were telling her a secret the forest wanted to keep. The sound was pain. It was the sound of a machine breaking down, a desperate, failing cadence of tooth against tooth. She took another step, her hand trailing along the rough bark of a familiar oak, her internal map of this patch of woods as clear as any drawing. The smell was wrong, too. Beneath the clean, metallic scent of snow and damp earth, there was something else. A sharp, artificial fragrance of citrus and spice, incongruous and alarming. And under that, the faint coppery tang of blood. The chattering grew louder. She followed it, her boots making no sound. A small ghost in a gray hooded coat. Then her foot nudged something. It wasn't a log. It was too soft. She knelt, her gloved fingers reaching out into the cold air, and met the texture of fine, wet wool. It was a man's arm. Her fingers traced the expensive fabric of a suit jacket, now ruined and stiff with ice. She moved them higher, past a shoulder, to a neck, and then to a face. The skin was shockingly cold, like river stone in winter, and covered in an icy stubble. The chattering was coming from his mouth. His whole body was a single, violent shiver. He was dying. Alara's voice was a low growl of disbelief and fury. "You brought what home?" She stood in the doorway of their small one-room cabin, silhouetted against the warm lamplight, her face a mask of granite wrinkles and suspicion. Lily stood on the porch, her small frame straining, the man's arm draped over her shoulder, his dead weight a near impossible burden. "He was making the breaking sound, Grandma. He's cold." The man moaned, a sound that was barely human, and sagged, his knees buckling. Alara let out a string of curses that were as ancient and earthy as the forest itself before she moved, her movements surprisingly swift for a woman of her years. Together they dragged him inside, a dead weight of wet wool and frozen ambition, his polished Italian shoes scuffing trails of snow and mud across the worn wooden floorboards. He was a creature from another world, a world of glass towers and sharp angles, and he had crash-landed in theirs. They laid him on the rag rug before the stone hearth, and Alara began to work. She was a whirlwind of focused energy, barking orders that Lily followed without question. "Get the quilts, the old wool ones. No, not the down. It'll be useless if it gets damp. Get the snow melt boiling. And bring me the shears." The shears made a brutal, tearing sound as Alara cut away the ridiculously expensive suit. The fabric, designed for boardrooms and shareholder meetings, was no match for the practical steel of her shears or the grim reality of hypothermia. Underneath, he wore a silk shirt that was plastered to his skin like a second, colder flesh, and an undershirt that was soaked through. Piece by piece, they stripped away the layers of his identity, the uniform of his power, until he was just a man, pale and shivering violently on their floor. His body was a road map of fading bruises and new cuts, but it was the cold that was killing him. His lips were blue, his skin marbled. Alara pressed her fingers against his neck, then his wrist. "Pulse is thready. Like a frightened mouse, she muttered, more to herself than to Lily. He's deep in it. They wrapped him in a cocoon of heavy wool blankets, piling them on until he was just a mound before the fire. Alara forced his jaw open and poured a trickle of warm, spiced broth between his chattering teeth. Most of it dribbled out, but some went down. "Come on, city man," she grunted, rubbing his limbs vigorously through the blankets. "Fight! Don't you dare die on my floor. It's a devil to clean." Lily sat by his head, her small hand resting on the wool near his face. She could feel the tremors that racked his body, the desperate, involuntary fight for life. She didn't know who he was or why he was in their woods, dressed for a party in the middle of a snowstorm. All she knew was the breaking sound and the feeling of a life fluttering on the edge of silence. She leaned closer, her voice a soft whisper against the crackle of the fire and the rising howl of the wind outside. "It's warm in here," she said, as if telling him a secret. "You can stop shivering now. You're safe." His world was a fractured nightmare of ice and noise. He was falling from a great height, the wind a shrieking monster in his ears, the glass of his corner office shattering into a million frozen shards around him. He saw Chloe's face, her expression a mixture of anger and heartbreak, her voice sharp with accusation. "It's always about the bottom line, isn't it, Dad? People are just numbers on a spreadsheet to you." The spreadsheet was in front of him now, endless columns of figures that swam before his eyes, blurring and reforming into icy fractals. The numbers were mocking him, laughing at him. He was trying to close a deal, the biggest deal of his career, a hostile takeover of a rival firm. His voice, usually so commanding, was a weak, chattering thing he couldn't control. "The margins, the shareholder value," he stammered, but his words turned to ice in his mouth. Then the boardroom dissolved, and he was back in the helicopter. The rhythmic thwump, thwump, thwump of the rotors was deafening, but it was being drowned out by an alarm, a high-pitched, insistent shriek that meant something was catastrophically wrong. The pilot was shouting, his words lost in the chaos. The helicopter lurched violently, and Arthur Vance, CEO of Vance Industries, a man who controlled a global empire from the 62nd floor, was suddenly, terrifyingly powerless. The world outside the window was a spinning vortex of white, snow and sky and trees, all blurring into a meaningless, terrifying swirl. He remembered the sickening lurch of the impact, the scream of tearing metal, and then silence, a profound ringing silence that was colder and more terrifying than the noise. He had pushed his way out of the wreckage, disoriented, his ankles screaming in protest. The pilot and his co-pilot were gone. Just gone. He had stumbled through the snow, driven by a primal, irrational instinct. His phone had no signal. His multi-thousand-dollar watch, a marvel of Swiss engineering, was a useless weight on his wrist. Its tiny, intricate gears were no match for the overwhelming, brutal simplicity of the cold. He had walked for hours, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost its meaning. The forest was a relentless, monochrome maze. Every tree looked the same. The cold was a living thing, a predator that had started at his fingers and toes and was now gnawing its way into his core, into his very soul. It was a cold that leached away thought and hope and memory until all that was left was the shivering, the raw, mechanical, involuntary act of a body trying to keep its spark alive. And through it all, through the fever dream memories of his daughter's disappointed face and the shrieking alarm of the crash, A new sound began to filter in. A soft voice, like the gentle ringing of a small silver bell. "It's warm in here. You're safe now." The voice was an anchor in the storm of his delirium. He clung to it, a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. Warmth, safety. These were concepts his mind could no longer process, but his body yearned for them. He fought his way towards the voice, through layers of icy fog, struggling towards that small, persistent light in the all-consuming darkness. Consciousness returned, not in a rush, but in slow, painful waves. The first thing he registered was warmth. A deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to be radiating from his very bones. It was a novel sensation, a forgotten luxury. The second was the smell. Not the sterile, filtered air of his penthouse or the faint scent of leather and polish in his limousine, but something rich and complex. Wood smoke, the earthy aroma of simmering herbs, and the clean, faint scent of laundry, dried in the open air. The third was the silence. Not the insulated, dead silence of his soundproofed office, but a living silence, punctuated by the gentle crackle of a fire and the soft murmur of the wind outside. Arthur opened his eyes. The light was dim, golden, dancing with shadows. He was looking at a ceiling made of rough-hewn wooden beams, darkened with age and smoke. He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness and a sharp, stabbing pain in his left ankle forced him back down with a groan. "Don't try to move, you fool!" The voice was raspy, belonging to an old woman. It held no sympathy, only a kind of weary pragmatism. Arthur turned his head slowly. He was lying on a makeshift bed, a pallet of soft furs and quilts on the floor, near a large stone fireplace. A few feet away, an old woman sat in a rocking chair, a gnarled piece of wood in her hands, which she was carving with a small, sharp knife. She was ancient, her face a web of deep lines, her silver hair pulled back in a tight, practical bun. She didn't look at him, her attention focused on her carving. "Where am I?" Arthur's voice was a dry, unused croak. "You're in my house," she said, still not looking up. "And you're lucky to be alive. Another hour out there, and you'd have been frozen solid. My granddaughter found you." Granddaughter? He remembered the soft voice. He looked around the small cabin. It was a single room, but it was meticulously organized and surprisingly cozy. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with their faint, pleasant scent. Shelves filled with handmade pottery and glass jars lined one wall. A sturdy wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. It was a world away from everything he knew. The sheer, unadorned simplicity of it was almost shocking. His corporate mind immediately started calculating, assessing. No electricity, he noted. The light came from the fire and 2 oil lamps. No running water, just a large bucket with a ladle near the door. No television, no computer, no phone. He felt a surge of panic, a primal fear of being disconnected. "I need to make a call," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of its usual authority. "There's been an accident, a helicopter crash. People need to be notified. My company—" The old woman finally stopped carving. She looked at him then, her eyes a startlingly pale blue, sharp and intelligent. They held a glint of something that might have been amusement, or perhaps pity. "There's no phone here, city man, no way to call anyone. The nearest town is a 2-day walk, and the pass is snowed in. You're not going anywhere." The finality in her tone was absolute. The panic turned to a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. He was trapped. Arthur Vance, A man who could move markets with a single phone call was trapped in a primitive hut with an old woman and her unseen granddaughter. "Who are you?" he demanded, trying to salvage some semblance of control. "I'm Alara, and the girl who saved your ungrateful life is Lily." She went back to her carving, the rhythmic scrape of the knife the only sound for a long moment. "You can rest," she said, her tone dismissing him completely. "There's nothing else for you to do." Humiliation and fury warred within him. He wasn't used to being dismissed. He wasn't used to being helpless. He looked down at himself. He was wearing a rough spun linen shirt and trousers, clothes that were not his own. His own clothes, his armor of success, were gone. He was stripped bare, reduced to nothing more than an injured man at the mercy of strangers. The fire crackled, spitting a cinder onto the hearth. Outside, the wind howled, a lonely, desolate sound. Arthur Vance closed his eyes and, for the first time since he was a small boy, felt utterly, hopelessly lost. The days that followed were a slow, agonizing lesson in powerlessness. His ankle was badly broken. Alara had set it with a practiced, no-nonsense efficiency, splinting it with 2 smooth pieces of wood and binding it with strips of cloth. The pain was a constant throbbing reminder of his situation. He was confined to the pallet of furs. His world shrunk to the few square feet around the hearth. His only activities were sleeping, eating the simple, nourishing broths and stews Alara prepared, and watching. He watched Alara as she moved about the cabin, her hands always busy. She tanned hides, she ground herbs with a mortar and pestle. She mended clothes with neat, small stitches. Her movements were economical and purposeful, a stark contrast to the performative busyness of the executives in his world. And he waited to see the girl, Lily. He heard her sometimes, her soft footsteps outside, the quiet murmur of her voice as she spoke to her grandmother. But she never came near him. It was as if he were a wild, unpredictable animal they had brought inside, one to be observed from a safe distance. His frustration grew into a sour, simmering anger. He tried to assert himself the only way he knew how. "I can pay you," he said to Alara one afternoon, his voice raspy. "Handsomely. Once I get out of here, I'll make sure you're set for life. Just tell me what you need. A new house? A car?" Alara didn't even pause in her task of grinding dried roots into a fine powder. "We have a house," she said calmly, "and nowhere to drive a car." "Everyone has a price," Arthur insisted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It was his mantra, the core principle upon which he had built his empire. "What do you want?" She finally looked at him, her pale eyes fixing him with an unnerving stare. "I want you to be quiet. Your talking uses up the air." The sheer effrontery of it left him speechless. He was offering her a fortune, and she was telling him to be quiet. The world had turned upside down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he met the granddaughter. He had woken from a restless, pain-filled sleep to find her sitting on a small stool not far from his bed. She was a small girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, with a cascade of dark hair and a pale, serious face. She was polishing a piece of wood with a soft cloth, her movements gentle and focused. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a beautiful, clear shade of blue, like her grandmother's, but they were unfocused. They stared at a point somewhere over his left shoulder, seeing nothing. She was blind. The realization hit him with a jolt. The girl who had found him in the vast, snowy wilderness, who had saved him from freezing to death, couldn't see. "Hello?" he said, his voice softer than he intended. She turned her head towards the sound of his voice. A small shy smile touched her lips. "Hello. You're awake. Grandma said you sleep a lot." "I suppose I do," he said. "My ankle." "I know. I heard it snap when you tried to stand on it yesterday," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. It sounded like a dry twig breaking. He winced at the description. "You are Lily?" "Yes, I'm Arthur." He waited for some reaction, some sign of recognition at his name, but there was none. To her, he was just Arthur, a man with a broken ankle. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. For finding me." "You were easy to find," she said simply. "You were very loud." She held up the piece of wood she had been polishing. It was a bird, exquisitely carved, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. The details were incredible, from the individual feathers to the tiny, sharp beak. "My grandmother carves them. I make them smooth." He looked from the bird to her unseeing eyes, and a wave of something he couldn't name, awe, confusion, a profound sense of dislocation, washed over him. A blind girl was polishing a carving of a bird she would never see. Here, in this cabin, cut off from everything he considered to be the real world, the rules of logic seemed to have been suspended. He was the powerful one, the one with vision, the one who could see the big picture. Yet he had been blind in the forest, stumbling towards his death, while this small, sightless girl had navigated it with an assurance that bordered on magical. She had found him not with her eyes, but with her ears. She had heard his brokenness. And as he lay there, watching her small hands move over the smooth wood, he had the unsettling feeling that she could see him more clearly now than anyone had in a very long time. Lily became his primary companion. Alara tolerated his presence with a gruff stoicism, tending to his physical needs with a brisk efficiency that bordered on contempt. But Lily seemed curious about the strange creature that had invaded her quiet world. She would sit near him for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just working on her own small tasks. She taught him the geography of her world, a world defined not by sight, but by sound and texture and scent. "That's the sound of the north wind," she told him one day, her head cocked towards the chimney, through which a low moan was emanating. "It's colder than the west wind. The west wind whispers, but the north wind growls." She brought him things to touch, to feel. A piece of granite, smooth and cold on one side, rough with lichen on the other. A pine cone, its scales sharp and perfectly ordered. A bird's feather, impossibly soft and light. "Close your eyes," she would command in her soft voice. "Tell me what it is." He would fumble the object in his hands, his sense of touch, so long neglected in a world of touch screens and paperwork, feeling clumsy and dull. At first, he was just humoring her, playing a game to pass the endless monotonous hours. But slowly, grudgingly, he began to notice things. The subtle difference in texture between oak bark and birch bark. The way a single drop of melted snow felt as it rolled across his skin. He was living in a purely sensory world, and it was Lily who was his guide. She asked him questions about his world, questions of such a stunning, guileless simplicity that he found them almost impossible to answer. "What does a skyscraper look like?" she asked once. He tried to explain. "Well, it's a building. It's very, very tall, made of glass and steel. It goes up so high it almost touches the clouds." "Why?" she asked. "Why does it need to be so tall?" He faltered. "Well, to fit more people in." more offices. It's efficient. Is it beautiful? She asked. He thought of his own building, the Vance Tower, a gleaming monument to his own ego. He had always considered it beautiful, a symbol of his power and success. But trying to describe it to her, he found the words failing him. He spoke of its clean lines, its reflective surfaces, the way it dominated the skyline. But he couldn't convey the feeling of it, the soul of it. Because, he realized with a start, it didn't have one. Some people think so, he finally answered, the words feeling hollow. Her world, in contrast, was full of a deep, intrinsic meaning. Every object in the cabin had a story. The heavy wooden table was made by her grandfather from a tree that had been struck by lightning. The clay pots were shaped by her grandmother's hands from mud dug from the river bank. Everything was connected. Everything had a purpose beyond its mere function. His world was one of disposability, of upgrades and replacements. Hers was one of permanence, of care and history. He learned about her life in small fragments. Her parents were gone. She never spoke of them, and he didn't dare ask Ilara. She had not been born blind. There was an accident, she told him one day, her voice very small. When I was 6, there was a fire. My eyes were hurt by the smoke and the heat. She said it without a trace of self-pity, as a simple statement of fact. But Arthur felt a pang of something, a vicarious sense of loss that was sharp and painful. To have seen the world, the color of the sky, the face of her grandmother, and then to have it all taken away. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate. She turned her face towards him, and for a moment he had the strange sensation that her unseeing eyes were looking right through him. "It's all right," she said. "Grandma says there are different ways of seeing. She says some people have eyes, but are blind to what's important." The words hung in the air between them, in the warm, fire-lit space of the cabin. Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. He thought of his daughter, Chloe, and her accusations. "You don't see the damage you're doing, Dad. You don't see the people you're hurting." He had dismissed her as a naive idealist, a child who didn't understand the hard realities of business. But now, lying broken and helpless in a wilderness cabin, being cared for by a blind girl, he wasn't so sure. He was beginning to suspect that he was the one who was truly blind. The storm arrived without warning, a raging blizzard that descended from the mountains and engulfed the small cabin in a vortex of wind and snow. The world outside disappeared, replaced by a churning, howling whiteness. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the wooden shutters and probing for any weakness in the cabin's sturdy walls. Inside, the atmosphere grew tense. Ilara moved about with a grim, tight-lipped expression, checking the seals around the door and windows, her face etched with worry. "This is a bad one," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm, the kind that can bury a house. For 2 days they were prisoners. The snow piled up against the cabin, darkening the windows, plunging them into a perpetual twilight, lit only by the flickering flames of the hearth. The howling of the wind was a constant, unnerving presence, a reminder of the raw, untamable power of the nature they had tried to keep at bay. On the 3rd day, the sound changed. The constant roar was punctuated by a sharp, cracking noise from above, followed by the heavy thud of snow sliding from the roof. Then there was a different sound, a groan of stressed wood, and a loud, splintering crack. that seemed to come from the very bones of the cabin. Water began to drip from the ceiling, slow at first, then faster. A steady, miserable plink, plink, plink onto the wooden floor. "The main beam," Alara said, her voice strained. "A heavy branch must have come down on the roof. The weight of the snow. It's cracked." Arthur pushed himself up on his elbows, his heart pounding. The image of the roof collapsing, of them being buried alive, was terrifyingly real. For the first time, the danger wasn't an abstract concept on a balance sheet. It was immediate, physical, and visceral. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice tight. Alara was already moving. "We have to brace it, and I have to get up on the roof, clear the snow." "You can't go out in that!" Arthur protested. "It's suicide." "Staying in here while the roof falls in is also suicide," she retorted sharply. "I have to try." But when she tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. The snow was piled too high, too heavy. They were sealed in. A heavy silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the drip of water and the groan of the tortured beam above them. Despair, thick and suffocating, settled over Arthur. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in a dramatic corporate showdown, not in a peaceful old age, surrounded by the trappings of his success, but buried in a primitive hut in the middle of nowhere. He looked at Lily. She was sitting calmly on her stool, her face pale in the dim light. But her expression was not one of fear. It was one of intense concentration, as if she were listening to something far away. Then he looked at Alara, who stood staring at the groaning beam, her face a mask of grim defeat. And in that moment, something shifted inside Arthur. For weeks, he had been a passive observer, a patient, a burden. He had done nothing but take their food, their warmth, their care. Now faced with a problem, a structural failure, his mind, so long dormant, began to work. He wasn't a woodsman, but he was an engineer by training. He had built his empire on his ability to see systems, to identify weaknesses, and to find solutions. "The table," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. Alara looked at him, bewildered. "What?" "The table," he repeated, pointing. "It's solid oak. If we can get it under the beam, it might hold." It was a desperate idea, but it was an idea. Hope, fragile but real, flickered back into Alara's eyes. Working together, they managed the Herculean task. Alara, with her wiry strength, and Arthur, pushing and pulling with his one good leg and his arms, grunting with pain and exertion, managed to maneuver the heavy table across the room. They used the woodpile logs as levers and fulcrums, a basic principle of physics Arthur hadn't thought about in 40 years. Inch by agonizing inch, they moved the table into position directly beneath the sagging, splintered beam. It wasn't a perfect fit. There was a gap of a few inches. "We need shims," Arthur panted, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the air. "Something to wedge in, to transfer the load." Lily, who had been silent throughout their struggle, spoke up. "The carvings," she said softly. Alara looked at her, then at the shelf where dozens of her beautiful, intricate bird carvings were displayed. Her life's work. A look of pain crossed her face, but then she nodded, a single, sharp dip of her chin. There was no other choice. One by one, they took the wooden birds and wedged them into the gap between the table and the cracking beam. A graceful swan, a fierce hawk, a tiny, delicate wren. The beautiful, useless objects were sacrificed for a practical, urgent purpose. The groaning from the beam lessened, then stopped. The steady drip of water slowed. The table, supported by a flock of silent wooden birds, was holding. Exhausted, they collapsed. Arthur on his pallet, Alara in her rocking chair. They had done it. They had saved themselves. Arthur looked at the strange, makeshift support column in the center of the room. It was absurd, illogical. A piece of fine furniture and a collection of folk art holding up a roof against the fury of a blizzard. But it was working. He had done something. He hadn't used his money, or his influence, or his authority. He had used his mind, his hands, his strength. He had contributed. He looked at Alara, her chest still heaving from the exertion. She met his gaze, and for the first time, her pale eyes held not contempt, but a grudging, hard-won respect. In the face of a shared crisis, the vast chasm between the city man and the mountain woman had, for a moment, been bridged. They were no longer rescuer and victim. They were partners in survival. The storm broke, and a profound, ringing silence descended. The world outside the cabin was transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The light that filtered through the partially cleared windows was bright and clean, reflecting off the snow with an almost blinding intensity. The immediate crisis was over, but a new, more subtle tension settled into the small space. The shared struggle had changed the dynamic between them. Alara spoke to him more, asking questions about his life, her initial hostility replaced by a wary curiosity. She told him stories of the mountains, of her husband who had been a logger, and of the changes she had seen in her long life. In turn, Arthur found himself talking about his own life with a candor he rarely used. He spoke of his relentless ambition, the thrill of the deals, the crushing weight of responsibility. And for the first time, he spoke of Chloe. He told Alara about their last argument, the bitter words they had exchanged. She said I didn't care about people, he confessed, his voice low. She said my company was poisoning the earth, all for profit. I told her she was a child, that she didn't understand how the world works. Alara listened, her hands busy with her mending, her face unreadable. Does she asked quietly when he had finished, understand how the world works? She understands that clean rivers are better than polluted ones, Arthur said, a note of bitterness in his voice. It's easy to have principles when you're not the one responsible for 100,000 jobs and the quarterly earnings report. Is a job worth more than a clean river? Alara asked, her question simple, direct, and devastating. Arthur had no answer. He had spent his life believing, truly believing, that the prosperity he created, the jobs, the economic growth, was a net good that far outweighed the side effects. He had always referred to environmental damage and human consequences as externalities, a neat, sterile term that kept the messy reality at a comfortable distance. Here, in this cabin, where life was so inextricably linked to the health of the forest and the river, that distance had collapsed. There were no externalities here. One afternoon, as he was watching Lily trace the patterns of frost on the window pane with her finger, she began to talk about the accident. She spoke of it in the fragmented, dreamlike way a child recalls trauma. It was summer, she said, her voice a near whisper. It was so hot. We went swimming in the creek, down by the old bridge. But the water smelled funny that day, like chemicals, and it made my eyes sting. Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. There was a factory upstream, Lily continued. It had been closed for years, but there were big barrels left there, all rusty. I think I think one of them must have leaked into the water." Her voice trailed off. "After we swam, my eyes started to hurt. Really bad. And then the world started to go dark, like someone was slowly turning down a lamp. And then it went out." Arthur's blood ran cold. A closed factory, rusty barrels, a chemical leak. His mind, trained to connect data points, to see patterns, was racing. He knew every asset, every subsidiary, every defunct property owned by Vance Industries. He knew the history of every acquisition. And he knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, which factory she was talking about. It was a chemical plant his company had acquired a decade ago as part of a larger portfolio. It was already decommissioned, a non-performing asset on the books. The environmental assessment had noted potential soil and groundwater contamination, but the cleanup costs were projected to be enormous, so he had done what any sensible CEO would do. He had his lawyers exploit a loophole, transferring the ownership to a shell corporation with no assets, effectively shielding Vance Industries from any liability. He had signed the papers himself. It was a standard procedure, a cost-saving measure, a footnote in a quarterly report, an externality. He looked at the small girl before him, this child who had saved his life, who had shown him more kindness than he deserved. And he understood that his footnote, his cost-saving measure, had a name. Her name was Lily. The neat, orderly world of spreadsheets and legal loopholes shattered, and the raw, horrifying human cost of his decision was sitting right in front of him. He was responsible. He had done this to her. The man who had built an empire, who had faced down corporate raiders and hostile governments, felt a wave of nausea and self-loathing so profound it threatened to suffocate him. The irony was so cruel, so monstrous, it was almost poetic. He had been stumbling blind through the forest, and he had been rescued by the very girl whose sight he had stolen. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thick, unbreathable. He had to tell them. He owed them that, at least. He looked at Alara, who was watching him. Her pale eyes narrowed with a sudden, sharp intuition. She knew. She didn't know the details, but she saw the guilt and horror on his face, and she knew he was connected to their tragedy. "Alara," he began, his voice a choked, broken thing. "The factory, the company that owned it. It was me." The confession hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Alara's face, already a landscape of hard-won wrinkles, seemed to calcify, hardening into a mask of cold, unforgiving fury. The needle in her hand stopped moving. The only sound was the crackle of the fire, which now seemed to mock the chilling silence that had fallen between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, each word a frozen, razor-sharp shard of ice. "You did this." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Arthur could only nod, the movement feeling heavy, sluggish. The weight of his guilt was a physical thing, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. I didn't know," he stammered, the words sounding feeble, empathetic even to his own ears. "I didn't know about her. It was a line on a report, a legal maneuver." "A line on a report," Alara repeated, her voice seething with a quiet, controlled rage that was far more terrifying than shouting. "You sit in your tall glass building and draw lines on paper, and my granddaughter goes blind. Do you have any idea what you took from her? She loved to draw. She knew the names of every flower, every bird. You didn't just take her sight. You stole her world." Arthur flinched as if she had struck him. Every word was a lash, and he deserved every one. He tried to explain, to make her understand the context of his world, the pressures, the distance. He spoke of fiduciary duty, of shareholder expectations, of the impersonal nature of corporate decision-making. But the words were hollow, meaningless justifications in the face of the devastating reality of a little girl's darkness. "Stop," Alara commanded, her voice cutting through his pathetic excuses. "Stop talking. I have listened to the empty words of men like you my whole life. Men who talk about progress while they poison the rivers. Men who talk about profit while they tear down the forests. Men who never have to look into the eyes of the people they hurt." She stood up, her small frame radiating an immense, righteous anger. "I should have left you in the snow." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He bowed his head, unable to meet her gaze. She was right. He deserved to have frozen to death. It would have been a just end. He had been so obsessed with building his legacy, a monument of wealth and power. But what was his true legacy? A poisoned creek, a blind girl, a world of unintended consequences. He had been too arrogant and too insulated to see. He waited for her to tell him to get out, to cast him back into the wilderness. He deserved it. He would have gone. But the command didn't come. Instead, the silence was broken by a small, soft voice. "Grandma, no." Lily had moved from the window. She stood beside her grandmother's chair, her small hand reaching out to find Alara's arm. Her face was turned towards Arthur, and her expression was one of profound, heartbreaking sadness. "It's not his fault," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The man in the tall building didn't know about the little girl by the creek. He couldn't see me." The simple, devastating innocence of her words shattered what was left of Arthur's composure. He made a choked, sobbing sound, and the tears he hadn't shed in decades began to stream down his face. Hot, shameful tears of guilt and regret. He wept for the girl she had been, for the colors she could no longer see, for the future he had stolen from her. He wept for his own profound, monstrous blindness. Lily walked slowly towards the sound of his sobbing. She navigated the small space with a familiar grace, her hands outstretched. She stopped before him, her face level with his. She couldn't see the tears tracking through the stubble on his cheeks, but she could hear the ragged, broken sound of his grief. She reached out her small hand and touched his face. Her fingers were gentle, hesitant. They traced the path of a tear. "Don't cry," she whispered. "It won't bring the light back." In that moment, faced with the pure, unearned grace of her forgiveness, Arthur Vance finally understood. True power wasn't in a boardroom. True wealth wasn't in a stock portfolio. It was in this. In compassion, in empathy, in the ability to see the humanity in another person, even when they have wronged you. The blind girl, in her infinite wisdom, had given him the one thing he didn't deserve: absolution. And in doing so, she had shown him what it truly meant to see. He had come into this wilderness a king, and he would leave it a beggar. But he would leave with something he hadn't had before: a soul. The thaw came, both outside and in. The snow began to melt under the strengthening sun, and the sound of dripping water from the eaves was no longer a threat, but a promise of release. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from a tense standoff to a quiet, somber period of healing. Alara's anger subsided, replaced by a weary resignation. She still wouldn't look Arthur in the eye, but she tended to his needs, her movements no longer laced with contempt, but with a kind of heavy sorrow. They were all victims of a system, a way of life, that was bigger than any one of them. The true work of healing, however, happened in the long, quiet conversations between Arthur and Lily. He told her everything. He explained the intricate, impersonal machinery of his corporation. He didn't make excuses, but tried to show her how a man could become so disconnected from the consequences of his actions. He described the view from his office. The city spread out below like a circuit board, the people like ants. "When you're that high up," he said, his voice filled with a newfound shame, "you forget that the ants have names. You forget they have families, and that they can get hurt." Lily listened with an unnerving attentiveness. She didn't judge. She just asked questions. "Is being that high up lonely?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. "Yes," he admitted, the truth of it surprising him. "It's very lonely." She, in turn, described her world to him, the world he had unknowingly condemned her to. But she didn't speak of it as a prison. She spoke of its richness, its beauty. She described the symphony of the forest in the morning, the feel of the sun on her face, the smell of rain on dry earth. She had built a new world for herself, one based on the senses he had long ignored. He learned that her blindness had given her a different kind of sight, an intimacy with her surroundings that he, with his perfect vision, had never known. One day, a sound broke the familiar stillness of the forest. It was a low, rhythmic chopping noise in the distance. A woodsman. Rescue. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over Arthur. Relief, certainly, but also a strange kind of regret. He was not ready to leave. His journey here wasn't finished. The woodsman, a burly man named Thomas, was shocked to find them. The news of the downed helicopter had been out for weeks, but the search had been called off, the occupants presumed dead. It took another day for him to get word to the authorities, and soon the sky was filled with the thwump, thwump, thwump of a rescue helicopter, the sound that had once been the soundtrack to Arthur's nightmares, now a symbol of his return to the world. As the paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher, he looked at the small cabin that had been his prison, his hospital, and his sanctuary. It looked so small and fragile against the vastness of the wilderness. His gaze fell on Ilara and Lily, standing by the door. He asked the paramedic to wait. He hobbled over to them on the crutches they had given him. He stood before Ilara, the formidable old woman who had saved his body and judged his soul. "There are no words," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "to thank you or to apologize." She just nodded, her pale eyes finally meeting his. There was no forgiveness in them, not yet, but there was a flicker of understanding. Then he knelt, wincing at the pain in his ankle, so he was eye level with Lily. He took her small hands in his. "I am going to fix this," he said, his voice a quiet, fervent promise. "I don't know how yet, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to make this right." She smiled, a small, sad, wise smile. "Just see the people, Arthur," she said softly. "Don't forget to see the people." The helicopter lifted off, and the cabin shrank below him, becoming a tiny speck in an endless sea of green and white. Arthur Vance was leaving the wilderness, but he knew with an absolute certainty that the wilderness would never leave him. He was a different man from the one who had crashed here. The old Arthur Vance had died in the snow. The one who was returning had just been born. The return to civilization was a violent, jarring assault on his newly awakened senses. The noise, The smells, the frantic, relentless pace of the city were overwhelming. His penthouse felt like a sterile, soulless museum. His expensive clothes felt like a costume. He looked at his face in the mirror and saw a stranger, a man with haunted eyes and a story etched into the new lines around them. His world, which had once seemed the center of the universe, now felt hollow and artificial. The first thing he did was call his daughter. Chloe arrived at his penthouse expecting a confrontation, her face braced for another argument. Instead, she found her father sitting quietly by the window, looking out at the city he had once sought to conquer. He was thinner, his hair grayer, but the arrogant, domineering energy that had always surrounded him was gone. He simply said, "You were right. I was wrong, and I am so sorry." And then he told her everything. He told her about the crash, the cold, the cabin. He told her about Ilara, and he told her about Lily. He wept as he spoke, and for the first time, Chloe saw not a CEO, not a titan of industry, but just her father, a broken man seeking redemption. She went to him and held him, and in that embrace, the years of anger and resentment between them began to dissolve. The old Arthur Vance would have solved the problem with money. He would have written a check, set up a trust fund, and considered the matter closed, a transaction. But the new Arthur understood that this was not a debt that could be paid. It was a wound that had to be healed. He began to dismantle his own empire. He sold off the subsidiaries that had questionable environmental records, a move that sent shockwaves through the financial world and enraged his board of directors. He faced their fury with a calm resolve they had never seen before. He was no longer interested in their metrics of success. He took the massive profits from the sales and established the Lilly Foundation, an organization with a dual mission: to fund the cleanup of industrial sites abandoned by corporations like his, and to provide lifelong support for families affected by the consequences. He put Chloe in charge and watched with pride as she tackled the role with a passion and intelligence that far surpassed his own. His work was not just about atonement, it was about change. He used his considerable influence to lobby for stronger environmental regulations, fighting against the very loopholes his own lawyers had once so skillfully exploited. He became a pariah in the world he had once ruled, a traitor to his class. And he had never felt more alive. 6 months after his rescue, he returned to the mountains. He didn't come in a helicopter, but in a simple 4-wheel drive truck, which he parked at the end of the logging road. He walked the rest of the way, his ankle now fully healed. The cabin was just as he remembered it, a bastion of quiet permanence in a changing world. Ilara greeted him at the door. Her expression was guarded, but she stepped aside to let him in. Lily was sitting by the fire, and she turned her head at the sound of his footsteps, a bright, genuine smile illuminating her face. "Arthur, you came back!" He spent the afternoon with them, not as a CEO or a benefactor, but as a friend. He told them about the foundation, about the work Chloe was doing. He didn't present it as a gift, but as a simple report on his progress, an accounting of the promise he had made. He had also brought with him the world's leading pediatric ophthalmologist. He had flown the man in from Zurich. The doctor examined Lily gently, his assessment quiet and thorough. The verdict was a painful one. The damage from the chemical burn was too severe, the nerves too scarred. There was nothing that could be done. Her sight was gone forever. Arthur felt a crushing wave of disappointment, a return of the old, familiar guilt. He had failed. He had not been able to fix it. That evening, after the doctor had left, Arthur sat with Lily on the small porch, listening to the evening symphony of the forest. "I'm sorry, Lily," he said, his voice heavy. "I wanted to give you your sight back. I wanted to give you the world." She reached out and found his hand, her small fingers lacing with his. "You did," she said softly. "You're cleaning the rivers. You're helping the other families. You're giving them a world that's safe, a world that's clean." She squeezed his hand. "Besides," she added, a note of gentle mischief in her voice, "you don't need eyes to see what's beautiful." He looked out at the darkening forest, at the first stars beginning to appear in the vast, clear sky. He saw the intricate patterns of the bark on the trees. He heard the gentle murmur of the wind. He felt the cool, clean air on his skin. He finally understood what she meant. He had spent his life chasing a distorted vision of success, blind to the true beauty and value of the world around him. It had taken a little blind girl to teach him how to see. His legacy would not be the tower of glass and steel that bore his name. It would be a clean creek in the mountains, the laughter of a child who could swim without fear, and the quiet understanding that the most valuable things in life are the ones that can never be bought or sold. He was no longer a king. He was just a man, and for the first time in his life, he was free.